All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Monday, August 23rd of 2021. Thank you for tuning into the stream. Whether you are watching me live here or listening or watching back as a recording, I appreciate you being here. It was an awesome weekend here for SaberSim out in Denver. Me and a few of the other guys were out at the FanDuel Baseball Championships. Had a lot of fun at that event. A decent showing from the SaberSim crew overall. If you were following along, Giant Squid was hanging on to second for a while at the ninth inning of the Padres and Phillies game on Saturday night. We were rooting for Aaron Nola to lock down the win. It was a 3-1 game in the bottom of the ninth. Nola came back out in the ninth inning to get the complete game, which was pretty exciting. He started that inning with a strikeout, a lot of excitement for the SaberSim team, and then gives up a huge 2-run bomb to Jake Cronenworth there in the bottom of the ninth to tie up the game. Nola gets pulled, and Giant Squid ended up locking down second. So still a very awesome showing for him. Very close to pulling down that first place. Also, congratulations to Couch and Kurt, who were there playing with a couple seats each. I know they had decent nights as well. So a lot of fun overall. Congratulations again to everybody at SaberSim that was competing in that event, but had a good time there. Let's see, real quick, I know we get new viewers here on the stream every single day, so that is awesome. And before I get started, if you are watching this for the first time, this is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from SaberSim users about DFS, about SaberSim, whatever you guys want to talk about. I do the show live for a reason, so if you're watching me here along, please ask questions. Please contribute your thoughts in either YouTube chat or in the Office Hours channel on Slack. The best shows we get are always the ones where we're getting a lot of questions, a lot of engagement from you guys as we are moving along. So please ask questions, please ask follow-up questions and things like that. One last housekeeping item before I move us forward into questions. We've got a lot of questions today. Plenty came through through support over the weekend. I see we've got a bunch of questions from over the weekend in the Slack channel, so plenty to talk about today. But before I move forward, I will mention that we do have our new redesign available in beta to all existing SaberSim users. So if you are a SaberSim subscriber, you can go to beta.sabersim.com, sign in with your existing credentials, and check out our new visual update. There are a bunch of visual changes. Obviously, the app pretty much got a full facelift, but there are also a lot of quality of life, functional changes, things like that, that make, I think, the app a lot easier to use. There's a lot of features people have been asking for a long time, including things like dark mode. That seems to be one of the things that gets the most excitement, but also min and max exposures before build, customizable tables, a better mobile optimized experience, resetting team totals all at once, bulk resetting of team totals, minimum uniques on your builds, custom build control over your pool size when you build lineups. I could keep going on and on. There's a lot of awesome stuff. So please check out the beta. If you are interested in trying it out, send me a DM in Slack once you're in there poking around, and I will add you to our private beta channel in Slack, which is where we are keeping all of our feedback and bug reports and things like that in that channel. So we've been quickly working through fixes in there. If you guys see, we are using that little memo, that little notepad emoji as a emoji basically saying that it's on our radar. We've taken note. We are marking everything as fixed with a little green check mark when things get fixed and reaching back out to people to let people know issues are fixed. And then I think Matt and some of the devs are using the eyes emoji to let people know that they're actually actively looking at that issue right now. So trying to keep the lines of communication open, keep everything transparent as we're working through issues. But thank you to everybody that has already reached out to join the beta. It has been very helpful having your guys' feedback. I think we've got almost 60 users, or just over 60 now, users in there testing it out, playing with builds in there. So it has been a lot of help. We are, again, in a big push to try to release this before football. Still got a handful of things that we need to get worked out before then. But again, thank you so much for everybody that has already helped out. We are very excited about that here. I see Andrew noticed the puppers in the back. Yeah, that's our girl. That's Missy. She is a cameo here on a lot of shows. So looks like she's conked out pretty good there, but might see her get up here halfway through the show or something like that. Maybe go get herself some food. screwed. But anyway, a few folks are trickling in here now. Jim and James are here. Welcome, everybody. I did have a great weekend. I hope you guys had good weekends too. So a few people starting to roll into the stream. We'll go ahead and get things started. So I mentioned we've got a lot of questions. We'll get through everything here today. Pretty excited about some of the questions that have come in. Torin just rolled up. What's up, man? How's it going? Anyway, I will say now that we've got a few more users in here, again, please just remember, ask any questions you guys have. YouTube chat, Office Hours channel on Slack, and we will go ahead and get started. So really good question here. Just to get things kicked off, I think this is a good question for beginners here. But question says, what's the difference between cash and GPP? So yeah, really good question. And I think if you're still getting used to DFS overall, it can be a little unclear what these things mean. You'll see style as soon as you pop up the build settings in the app. But we have a few drop downs here. The two at the top, probably the most commonly used overall, are GPP and cash. So we'll start with cash. Cash games refer to 50-50s, double ups, head-to-heads. I think triple ups also can kind of, technically a triple up is a multiplier, but I think it kind of fits under that cash umbrella. You're basically looking for payout structures that are going to take generally about half or half-ish of the field and double up their money, right? So again, yeah, head-to-heads, 50-50s, double ups, things like that. I guess triple ups really don't fit in there. Really, this is a payout structures question and what percentage of the field are getting paid out. So when you're thinking about cash games, you can use the rule of thumb of just saying it's those contests. But what it really is it's about 50% of the field getting paid out, and the 50% is getting paid out flat. So when you play a double up, it doesn't matter if you come in first or if you come in 49th. If it's, well, a 50-50, it doesn't matter if you come in first or 49th, you're getting basically doubling your money up, right? Same thing with a head-to-head. You win, you double your money. That's pretty much it. Double ups, same deal. A GPP stands for guaranteed prize pool. And there are a lot of contests on the sites now that have guaranteed prize pools, including some cash games. But for a while, that wasn't necessarily the case. But GPP is really referring to tournaments. So you'll often find that it's about 20% of the field that's getting paid out. I think anywhere from 10 to 25% or so. There's various GPP styles. And the payout structures for those contests are stacking. So there'll be some min cash line right at around the 20% mark. And then that's typically 1.5 or 2 times your entry fee, and then it will grow from there. There'll be people that triple and quintuple their entry fees. There'll be people that 10x all the way to something like a Milli Maker, right? Where you are getting a huge return on your investment if you take down first in a contest like that. So again, GPP, about 20% of the field's getting paid out, and it's a stacking structure, a staircase structure where the highest overall scoring lineups win the most money. And you can look at our default sliders and we can get some idea about the right way to play these contests. So in cash games, we are essentially just concerned with building the best overall projected lineup possible. A cash game is more or less, there's some other strategies that can be employed, but you are more or less basically trying to solve what's called the knapsack problem, which is pack in as many average projected points as possible while staying under the salary cap. So we're not so concerned with the effects of correlation or ownership fade or smart diversity. We just want to build lineups that maximize projected points for the salary cap. And the reason why is, again, because of the payout structure. We are doubled up. Our money is doubled up if we end up in the top half of the entries in that contest. There's no incentive for us to shoot for an upside or a ceiling outcome. So we can take advantage of our average projected outcomes with our game simulations and build lineups that are optimized for that. That is essentially the goal of our cash games. In tournaments or GPPs, you're going to see a different structure, right? Our GPP sliders are often going to emphasize in some capacity the impacts of correlation, ownership fade, and smart diversity. So talking about why we're doing these things, right? We are paid out more for the best possible outcome in the contest, right? If we are paid more for first than we are even for second, it makes sense for us to try to build the lineup that is best optimized for upside, that has the highest ceiling outcomes for the given contest. So the effects of correlation will create stacks in your lineup, and it will prioritize players that are likely to do well together, because it makes it so that we don't have to predict, for example, on a DraftKings baseball lineup, 10 independent outcomes and all try to nail 10 independent ceiling outcomes, we can stack 5 of those players that play together on the same baseball team. And because hitters that don't get out and get on base give other hitters opportunity and other hitters opportunity to score more points, those players are correlated with one another. So a player like Jose Altuve, and we actually have correlation data for each player on the lineup because we simulate every game play by play thousands of times. We can actually quantify how correlated players are with another. We can see that Altuve has positive correlations with other players in the lineup. Now, of course, this means if Altuve and the rest of the Astros have a bad game, it's more likely that the rest of the players in the lineup have a bad game. But we're not concerned with downside in GPPs because all of the money is at top. So the downside event is we're not really concerned with that, right? We're just looking to maximize upside. We also need to take into account ownership fade because it's not just good enough to have a lineup that scores well or where the players meet their projections or meet their 85th percentile projections in a vacuum, right? We need to be the best overall lineup. If you nail the stack and you have the highest scoring stack on the night, but they're all 50% owned, that particular component of your lineup is only going to put you in the top 50th percentile of the lineups in the contest, which, as we just saw from our definition of GPPs, wouldn't even be enough to necessarily be in the cash line. So we take into account our projections of how owned players are going to be, and we value that in our builds. So we have a level of ownership fade here that's set to a default value depending on your contest that will say, basically, in a nutshell, if there are 2 players projected for the same amount of points, value the player that is projected at lower ownership higher. You can see our ownership projections here on the right side of the screen. That is what percentage of lineups we expect any of these players to be owned in typically a large field GPP. The way we generate these is by actually simulating all of the lineups that we think people might build. We build thousands of different lineups at extremely high diversity settings and use those for our ownership projections. So we want to weight the impact of ownership. And smart diversity is actually going to allow us to, one, make our lineups more diverse, obviously, but it's also going to incorporate upside. The way smart diversity works is that the higher this setting is, the smaller the buckets of random game simulations we use to determine each player's projection when we build every lineup. So we can look at a hitter like, again, maybe someone like Altuve and see that he's got this range of outcomes where his most common outcomes are pretty low scoring, right? That happens 16 and 18% of the time. But he's got very high ceiling potential here. Definitely game sims where he scores 25 plus points. And those are the kinds of game sims that end up leading to you taking down a GPP. So the higher your smart diversity is, the smaller the size of the bucket we use of game sims to determine the projection, which naturally it increases the relative importance of those outlier game sims into your lineups, right? In a very small GPP, like a 100 man or something like that, or maybe a 1,000 contest, this comes down because we don't need a performance that maybe is in that player's top 1% or top 5% even percent of their simulations. We can value more of their average performance, right? But in a contest like a big 150 max, something like this, right? These big contests that I know DraftKings runs every once in a while, the variance, the outcome you need to win that contest is such a high ceiling outcome that our smart diversity actually is cranked all the way to very high. We're looking at single game simulations to build those lineups, right? So correlation, ownership, and upside in the form of smart diversity are important for GPPs. And that's why you see these slider settings set the way they are. The last thing I will note on this before I move on is that these slider settings are data driven and they are back tested. The way we determine where we put our sliders for any given contest is we will actually look at historical contests that ran on the sites. We will build thousands of lineups at every single combination of sliders. You can see that is quite a bit when you actually start to think about all of the different combinations. And we will test and basically back test to see which slider settings build the highest expected value lineups for the given contest that has been specified. So you can use these with confidence, and you can also use them to check your intuition about questions about how to play these contests overall. So a very good question. I think always something very important to review. A good overall topic to cover here. So I don't think I got a name for this user that asked this question here in support, but I will get you a timestamped recording of this answer here. And if you have any follow-up questions for me, just feel free to shout them out. So all right, cool. So a very good question to get started. I have, again, a few questions that came in through support over the weekend. So I'm going to tackle these first, and then we will jump to all the questions that are in Slack and YouTube. So again, I think it's going to be a nice long stream for us today. So I will stay on here until we get through everything, and feel free to pop any questions into chat that you want me to answer here on the stream. Another good question from Kenneth. This came in over the weekend, and we'll get this popped in. And he said, when it comes to running stacks, should I select the teams I want to stack or go with the teams that are coming up in my research builds that SaberSim suggests? This is a good question, and I don't think this necessarily has like a binary answer. I think it is important, and I would highly recommend everybody to be doing whatever their individual research process looks like for a slate. If you like digging into StatCast data and advanced stats, that is great. If you run research builds like I do with very high smart diversity settings to determine where maybe some plays have some upside. If you like to enjoy other DFS content that's out there to determine top stacks or top pitchers or anything like that on the given slate, I think that is a great idea. But what I always recommend all users to do before you actually start really making any changes is to run what we call a test build. And I think Kenneth is referring to that here. And what that is going to be picking the contest settings that you are basically playing for that slate, or for the contest that you are going to be building lineups for. Let's go ahead and quickly just find it's a little bit easier to do this beforehand. So I'm going to do that here. Update to projections and run a build. And it will give you an idea of what SaberSim's approach on this slate is looking like, taking into account the effects of correlation and ownership fade and upside. And I think this can just be a very good thing to add on to your research process and make a part of your research process. So I don't think necessarily that the right answer to this question is to say, abandon your research and just do what SaberSim tells you, nor do I think the opposite is true. And I wouldn't say to just completely ignore SaberSim. We can go in here and look, and we can even expand this pool and maybe look at the first 100 lineups just to get a little bit more of an idea. But say you went in here convinced that Huascar Yanoa was the play at pitcher, while it may still be okay to use some Yanoa, and we can talk about ways in the tool that you could actually get him in more of your lineups, but this might be a good opportunity to check your prior research and maybe review and determine if you actually want to use him in a contest of this size. Similarly, if you had gone through and in your research process had determined that you thought the White Sox were the best overall stack on the slate, well, while it isn't our favorite overall stack, it is a team that pops up here, and SaberSim definitely thinks there is some win equity for that stack. So in this particular case, it might just be enough to go back to your 20 lineups and set a minimum exposure for the White Sox, who we are now not even getting here at all in our top 20. But we could go in and set a minimum exposure of 40 or something like that and drop this back down to 20 and get a little bit of White Sox, right? We had done some research that led us to wanting to play some White Sox bats anyway. SaberSim said, yep, there's definitely some upside there. There's some win equity for White Sox stacks, and we applied a minimum exposure. Similarly, I guess if you had come back here and maybe there was a team that your research was leading to you that wasn't showing up at all in this top 100 lineups for this given 20 max contest, that might be a sign that maybe that stack, or at least from the perspective of SaberSim with the default projections and sliders, doesn't have very much win equity for this kind of contest. So again, that's maybe a situation where that maybe is deserving of more research, right? Maybe you should spend a little bit more time, go back to some of your sources that recommended that, or your individual research, and dig in a little more. But let's say you've done your research and you're feeling confident in your decisions, and SaberSim really isn't giving you a lot of what you are looking for. That is still perfectly fine. In that case, I would recommend making some edits to the projections. So we mentioned Yanoa. Maybe we're feeling particularly bullish on him. He's got a low projection overall here at SaberSim. You're not getting a lot of him in your lineups already. I think the easiest thing to do here would then be to make some adjustments. And I always recommend users to make most of their adjustments on the team total side, because it is going to have a more holistic impact on your lineups. While we could just go ahead and bump up Yanoa, maybe all the way to 18 points, that's fine, but that's not really going to have the impact on the game overall. If Yanoa has a good game, right? It makes a lot of sense that the Yankees bats are probably going to have a not so good game. So I think instead the best approach would be to go over here and drop maybe the Yankees total. Let's try dropping them down to like 4-2 and hitting yes, and seeing what kind of impact that has overall on the projections. So it bumps Yanoa up to 15.09. So maybe we're comfortable with something like that. But you can also see it's going to drop down most of the Yankees bats, which it makes sense. That stands to reason. It also actually has a little bit of a minor effect even on the Yankees pitcher, right? Which maybe isn't something that would be completely intuitive at first glance, but based on our simulation data, when we isolate sims and we take sims where the Yankees score less than their average runs, we actually see that has a negative impact on Jordan Montgomery as well, probably because of the win bonus is what I'm thinking here. But that's not something that you maybe would have thought of if you were just doing this quickly on a player-by-player level, but it checks out, right? That makes sense. If the Yankees are going to score less runs, the odds of Jordan Montgomery getting his win bonus are lower, and the Yankees pitcher, actually, his projection comes down. So that is why I always recommend making those changes here on the team totals instead of just jumping right to the player projections, because it's going to have a more, holistic effect on the game overall. So coming back full circle to this question, again, I don't think you need to take this one way or the other. I don't think you need blind faith in SaberSim necessarily. And I also don't think that you should approach this by saying, I'm going to do all of my research alone and I'm just going to do exactly what I want to the app when I get there, right? I think I highly recommend doing your own research, consulting other sources, digging into any advanced stats, whatever really makes sense for you in your process, taking that, running your test build, and then seeing what you get, right? If you, in your individual research and SaberSim both have some agreement on a team, those are multiple different paths that are pointing to the same direction. I think that's a very good sign. I think if you and SaberSim disagree, it's probably a good opportunity to dig in, maybe do a little bit more research on that particular team or player and determine how you want to go. But of course, you are always welcome and encouraged to make any changes to projections that you want to if you have a different perspective on a game or player or the slate overall. And if you are going to do so, highly recommend doing that on the team totals here, because, again, it will allow the right changes to be made elsewhere in the projections. That makes sense. And this is true for all sports, at least all sports that have these game totals. I think basketball, football, always the same deal. Highly recommend making your adjustments here first. So, but really good question. Don't know if Kenneth is here watching along today, but Kenneth, if you are, let me know if that was helpful. Otherwise, I will get you a time-stamped recording of that question, and you are always welcome to ask any follow-up questions you've got for me. So I'm going to just keep us motoring through here. And I want to review some of these questions before. So this is a similar question, but I think the spirit of this or the kind of the question behind this is maybe a little bit different. So I'm going to pull it up here and talk about this. But this was from Adam in support. And he said, if I'm a 3-max or a 20-max player, is it best to just run the test build with the settings SaberSim is baked in and then adjust based on the stands I want to take more of? I was thinking that the approach was to build the test build, see what it was showing as what most people were doing, and then do my own build after. But I'm guessing that's wrong because SaberSim has already built those good leverage points into the build. And so I wasn't really seeing what most people were doing. Yeah. So Adam, I think you're on the right track here overall. And the main reason why is that since the owner on a test build, if you're just using default settings, the ownership fade slider is already going to be at probably a non-zero value, which means we are going to take into account ownership, or at least our projected ownership and your ensuing lineup or your test build that comes out of that is already going to have kind of some leverage stands baked into it. So I don't necessarily think the test build is the best way to get an idea of what the field is going to do. I think this is a build that is going to show you basically a set of what we feel like are our optimal lineups to play in that contest, and already have made some leverage decisions, right? So let's go ahead and reset our projected our exposures. I'm sorry. So if you're seeing, like, for example, Chicago 39% in 100 lineups, I imagine Chicago is not, so Chicago's probably not going to be an overly chalky team, right? Kind of middle of the road in run total. It's actually a pretty even slate here tonight, but it looks like we'll probably have some Astros chalk. And I don't know, maybe check Vegas to see who else is chalky. But if we're getting so much Chicago, it's probably already taking into account some component of ownership when you get them showing up in your lineup. So if you want to do a build that is very much directed at determining what the chalk is going to be, I actually recommend trying builds on the cash settings and actually setting a manual stacking rule in our stacking tab here to say maybe force a 5 stacking rule. And if you run a build like this, you are going to mimic very much what players that are using a traditional optimizer and just building based on mean projection with a force 5 stack rule built in. And running this kind of build actually, I think, is going to give you a much better idea of what the chalk is going to be. If you want to dial this in even one step further, I would go through and set the individual team totals to match Vegas precisely, and then run your chalk build. I call it a chalk build. I think that gives you a very good idea overall of what you might think the field is going to do. But when you run a build on default GPP settings, you are going to see what we feel like are viable lineups with some leverage points or some ownership fades already kind of baked in there. And then again, overall, I think the answer to the previous question is still true, that I think you can combine your own research with what you're getting in those SaberSim test builds and determine exactly how you ultimately want to play the slate. So, but I see Adam also had some other questions here that were kind of follow-ups, so we'll just handle each of these in order. Let me go ahead. Okay, so the follow-up question here was, as I mentioned, I might be refining too much, lowering stacks, players, etc. For instance, I'll think I need more of a certain team, which causes more lineups being required. I haven't been profitable yet, so perhaps I should be trusting SaberSim more. There's a lot of variance in baseball DFS. I would say unless you are looking at your results over at least probably a month, I would be careful of making any rash decisions about whether or not you are playing in a way that is profitable or not, right? It can take some time in a high variance sport like baseball to realize your edge in your contests. But I would say, I guess the main point I'm picking up out of this question is this, I'll think I need more of a certain team, which causes more lineups being required. I assume what that is referring to is the alert that pops up when you've made a lot of adjustments here on the exposures page that says you need to build more lineups. I think if you are repeatedly getting the message that you need to build more lineups, what is happening really is that there are not enough lineups in the pool of 200 or whatever they are overall that we can fit your exposures, right? That maybe you are taking heavy stands on certain players that SaberSim likes or dislikes, and there just aren't a lot of lineups in the pool. I would recommend, if that is the case, instead going back and adjusting some of the projections of certain teams here to force the builder to give you more lineups that you actually like. For example, maybe you've already determined that you want to maybe take a stand on a guy like Lance Lynn, right? Up against Toronto, good batting lineup. You want to be under on Lynn, but you're getting a ton of lineups with Lynn. And after you go into step 3 and eliminate him or cap his exposure and then make more adjustments, right? What's happening is that you're getting a message saying you need to build more lineups. I think in that particular case, I would just bump the team projection up for Toronto, for example, so that Lynn's projection naturally comes down and we will naturally get less of him in our lineups. That's probably the best way to do that overall. So I think this question in particular, right? The takeaways here, one is to be careful with small sample sizes on your process. It can take some time to realize your edge. I think at the end of seasons is by far the best time overall to judge what your process looked like, to judge how strong your approach was overall, because even a week or 2 weeks of samples for MLB sometimes, or most of the time, isn't enough to judge a process. If you're seeing a message overall that you need to build more lineups in step 3, I think it is a better approach to make some adjustments to your projections in step 1 here ahead of time, so that we build lineups that fit your impression of the slate or your research process of the slate overall a little more precisely. And then I guess the last point overall is, if you are concerned about making a lot of adjustments and you are finding that you are seeing the message to build more lineups a lot, it may be an indication to back off some of your adjustments just a bit. Again, no model's perfect, but our model is very good. It is beating Vegas closing lines in major markets for baseball this season. It is pretty well rigorous and back tested. So I would say maybe you could experiment with putting a little bit more trust in the model, and maybe explore. You can still find a lot of leverage on teams and still play within the bounds of the model, right? By running builds at high. What I like to do a lot is I like to run builds at very high smart diversity settings and turn ownership fade off. And I won't do a full build here, but I will do like a small one. Oops. Oh. So what I like to do is I will run something like this, and I'll just leave correlation where it is, but I'll turn smart diversity all the way up, and I'll let it build me 200 or so lineups. Well, actually, when I do it, I'll let it build 1,500, but 200 lineups is fine for the purpose of this. And I'll look at the entire pool and look how often certain teams stack up and how often they're showing up in this high smart diversity, high upside kind of build. And from there, I'll combine that with my own intuition or research about where I think the chalk is going to be on a certain slate, and find the opportunities of the teams that I want to be over and under on. So by doing it this way, I'm still kind of playing within the SaberSim model. I'm still making use of the model, but I'm looking for where SaberSim thinks the upside is. And I know I'm playing within kind of safe bounds there. So again, I assume, just on a quick look, I don't know exactly who's going to be chalk, but I assume Houston's probably going to be the chalky team. So that might be a team that I want to be a little under on if we think they're only the third best stack, and if the field is going to think they're the best stack overall. I think Colorado and the White Sox are some interesting teams that it seems like SaberSim thinks have some upside. In particular, Colorado, who I don't think is going to be a very chalky stack at all. That might be an interesting team. And I know, again, I'm working within the bounds of the model. I'm going to get a ton of lineups naturally that have Colorado and the White Sox bats in there, but I'm still finding a way to get leverage on the field. So I'm going to jump to your last question here, Adam, and then we'll move this on. But another good question here. And this last one was, in conjunction with generating numerous additional lineups, I've never looked too closely, but I assume they'd end up with lower Saber scores. Is there a lower limit of Saber score that I should avoid entering into contest? For instance, anything under 95. So yeah, another really good question, and actually one that I haven't really had asked before. But for those of you that don't know, Saber score is standardized to 100 for any given build. So let's go ahead and kind of reset this build here overall, and just look at our top 20 again. But, this happens sometimes. This is purely a bug. I've noticed it only after building another set of lineups that sometimes the Saber score will actually go back. It used to be unstandardized. It used to be that your Saber score at the top was just the highest one. And we recently standardized it to 100 to make it easier. So we'll run a quick build here to get our standardized Saber scores back. But anyway, while this is building here, or actually it's about done. So yeah, the top build in any lineup should always have a Saber score of 100, and then builds can be compared really to that top overall lineup based on what their Saber scores look like. I don't think that you need to eliminate lineups that are below a certain Saber score. I like to think in general that the pool of lineups that we build, given your individual contest your whatever contest you're playing is kind of a pool of initially viable lineups you can play in the contest. I think any of the lineups that are in this initial pool of 200 and probably a lot more beyond that are all viable. I don't think you need to eliminate lineups below a certain SaberScore. You certainly can, but that in effect is kind of what the sorting by SaberScore already does. It's going to maximize your overall SaberScore. It's going to give you the best overall SaberScore lineups by default. I don't think in addition to that you need to go through and eliminate anything with a lower SaberScore. I like to think about my pool overall as being kind of a playground of viable lineups from which it is up to me to adjust exposures and whatever to dial in and get my lineups where I want. I think your pool of lineups that you have in your broader pool here are going to be high upside, correlated, well leveraged lineups to begin with. It's regularly SaberScore of 70 or 80 or low 90s or something like that. That ends up being your highest actual scoring lineup anyway. So don't think you necessarily need to eliminate lineups below a certain SaberScore. But Adam, overall, very strong questions. I hope I was able to shed some light on some of this for you. I will get you a timestamped recording to these questions, but also the one right before this, because I think some of the ideas we talked about in that question would also be very helpful for you. But if you have any follow-up for me once you watch those recordings, just let me know. I see a few other questions starting to come in YouTube chat. So we will get to everything today, guys. I promise I like to tackle these questions in chronological order. So I have one more that came in over the weekend. I'm going to attack real quick. So that is everything I got in support over the weekend, but we did get a few questions in Slack. So I'm going to tackle these first, and then we will get to all the questions that are coming in live here. Jim did say, I like this chalk build idea. Yeah, I like it too. I think it can be very useful on certain slates where maybe it's difficult to kind of intuitively judge what the field is going to do or where ownership is going to go when just using our ownership projections or Vegas signals or things like that. It can be one nice tool to add in to get an idea of where the chalk is going to go. So, but real quick, let me jump over to Slack here and get some questions here. So this one came in from Ryan. It looks like on Saturday here. And he said, is it possible to build with the 90 plus percentile versus sorting after the build? At the moment, it is. We actually generally recommend that you don't do this because it is a bit has a double counting effect with smart diversity, right? So setting something like a 95th overall percentile and then building your lineups. Smart diversity is typically going to take care of all of the upside that you need in your lineup builds already by randomly bucketing game sims. The way I like to think about this is we don't need to build lineups assuming every player has their 95th percentile outcome, right? We want to rely on the real ranges of outcomes of players, bucket our game sims into small buckets and let the natural upside of certain players come through. So in our redesign, we are actually removing this pre-build. So you won't set a percentile pre-build anymore. I'll actually just go ahead and show you guys real quick what this looks like on the redesign. Oh, let me actually real quick do this because I am logged into a different account here on the redesign, but I'll log out and log back in and show you guys quickly what this looks like on the visual update, because I think it's in general better. And let's do this. Okay, cool. So on the new site, we actually just show the percentile projections here in the player pool or in your projections page. So I think the greatest use of percentiles on the current site is mostly just for research, looking for players that maybe for their projection or for their salary have a much higher or a disproportionately higher ceiling outcome. That might be a player that you want to emphasize in your builds, right? In the post-build process, so we'll run a quick build here. And hopefully this builds okay. I've noticed sometimes switching really quickly back and forth between classic and beta site on the same account sometimes can create a little bit of strange behavior, but hopefully this works okay. We do actually still allow you to change the percentile in the post-build process. So you can, one thing I like to do is to change your percentile here after you've built your lineups and to kind of cross-check it with your overall intuition about what kind of scores are required to win the contest that you play. It's not an exact science, but if you play enough of any one contest, you kind of get familiar overall relatively quickly with what kind of scores are needed to win those contests. So sometimes I will like to go and look at something like the 85th percentile outcome, update the projections, and see. So an 85th percentile outcome of this particular lineup gives me a score of around 197. It's a smaller slate, 6-game slate, something like that might be kind of enough to get you by, right? That might be a winning score in a contest like this. So I don't know. I like to kind of just look at it for that reason. But from the purposes of chasing upside and trying to get upside in your lineup, Smart Diversity is going to handle almost all of that for you. So okay, going to bounce back to the live site here, quickly refresh so that we're just all updated and keep us moving. This is a good question here, and I'm actually going to tackle kind of two questions at once because we got a question from Ryan and from Fisty here that are basically the same, and they're both NFL stacking questions. So the first one read, will we be able to specify only wanting double stacks? And then another question from Fisty here, also about NFL stacking. And he said, haven't messed with the NFL builder too much, but was trying to find a good way to get my main stack from one game and a mini stack from a different game. So yes, you can do this, and I will show you how. So you'll want to set manual stacking rules for this. So we'll talk about kind of both of these side by side. So under the stacking tool, and again, I think for now, I mentioned this last week, but I'm going to continue using the production site, the live site for now. That's obviously where the vast majority of our users are building their lineups. But as we get closer to the redesign, and definitely once it goes live for everybody, we'll shift over and I'll answer questions and walk you guys through everything on the redesign. But for now, we'll do it here. So first question, I guess, with double stacks. The easiest way to do that is, I guess, actually the default stacking rule is just going to do that for you. So it's going to say at least 3 players from the same team. It's actually always going to use a QB. So I know the messaging here isn't super clear, but it will always include a QB, and it will have at least 2 other players at the specified positions there. So maybe you don't want running backs in there, but this will basically stack a QB and always use an additional 2 players from the same team. So you can do a double stack just like that. But for Fisty's question here overall, if you wanted to get a mini stack from a different game, which I know trying to maximize these kind of micro correlations for especially the really large field stuff is pretty popular. You can do that here by setting another stacking rule. And I know a common stack that people like to do is to do something like at least 3 players from this, or maybe at least 2 players from the same game. And you can actually exclude the QB position in this case. And what it's going to do is this kind of build is going to do, first of all, it's going to make your double stack, right, of at least 3 players from the same team. And it's going to stack a quarterback with at least 2 wide receivers or a wide receiver and a tight end. And then this stacking rule is actually going to say of the remaining positions, the running back or wide receiver or tight end, there needs to be opposite sides of a different game that's used overall. And this will actually typically, well, I think it will just 100% of the time pick up a different game to build lineups for. And you can continue actually doing this. Like another stacking rule that I know people like to do is to pair their running back and defense actually on the same team. And you could set another stacking rule like that and say, okay, so now we want a double stack of a QB with his with 2 pass catchers, basically. Two of the other players at the skill positions also need to be a kind of mini game stack. And I also want my running back paired with my defense. And these kinds of stacking rules can maybe take a little bit longer for the builder to build, but let's go ahead and just build like 3 lineups like this. And we can actually just go ahead and do this. Still dialing in the NFL week 1 projections, so we won't take anything here too seriously, but it should obey the stacking rules. So let's go ahead and at least just look at the lineups. Real quick, we'll just set these real quick. Okay, and you can see, so now what we got here, you can see this first lineup, right? We got Joe Burrow and Tyler Boyd and T. Higgins. So our stack is satisfied there. We got opposing, we got Chase Edmonds and Julio Jones. So as kind of a mini game stack of the Arizona-Tennessee game. And Mike Davis is paired with the Falcons defense. So you can see all three stacks in this case are satisfied. Same deal here for the Saints. It looks like we're projecting Jameis Winston to start week 1 at the moment. But we've got Winston with Deontay Harris and Traquan Smith. We have Christian McCaffrey paired with the Panthers defense. And then it looks like a mini game stack of the same game as above with Cincinnati and Minnesota, where we have Boyd and Thielen on either side of each other. So you can create, I know in NFL in particular, people often like to have very, very nuanced control over their stacks, want all these kinds of different rules to make sure that every player is very kind of directly correlated with another in the lineups. So you can do all that and make sure that 100% of your lineups have those stacking rules using our stacking tool. The last note I will say on this before I move on is, again, you don't necessarily have to do any of this. Our correlation slider is going to value the impacts of correlation overall and make your lineups appropriately correlated to what we think makes sense for the given contest. So, for example, again, yes, we did have Chase Edmonds nicely correlated with Julio Jones here, but we can actually go in and click on Chase Edmonds and see that his correlation with Julio Jones is about 0.06. And had we just run a build by default, right, with the default settings, would we get Chase Edmonds with Julio Jones in 100% of lineups? No, but the builder would recognize that there was a small correlation between those players and might use them in a certain amount of lineups anyway. So, again, I know NFL in particular, people really like to have all these correlations built into every lineup, and that's fine. I've experimented with that a bunch in the past as well, and you can do that with the stacking rules, but don't feel like you have to do that at all by any stretch, because the correlation slider on its own is going to take care of a lot of that for you. So, but really good questions there from both Ryan and Fisty. Let's see. There was a question from Andrew, and then I saw Elusive Smoke here offered some good answers to that. So I actually will probably end up just summarizing his answers. But this question from Andrew said, what is a method for determining actual player ownership post-slate? Is there options on Saber or DraftKings for this? And Smoke said here, he responded by saying, for individual contests on DK, you can download the CSV after lock, and it shows you the ownership within that specific contest. Remember, ownership can vary greatly between stakes and contest types, though. So a guy that is 5% owned in the mini-max might be 10 in a big single entry contest or 8 in the main contest. That is exactly right. You can download those entry files from DraftKings for any given contest you need if you want to pull like a big data dump of all the ownerships of players in the contest. For me personally, a lot of times I will just literally just go into the contest on DraftKings while it's running or after it's run on my phone or on my computer and look at player ownerships from there. I think that's a very useful. I do a lot of work editing projected ownerships and making a lot of ownership tweaks overall. That can be really strong kind of individual review process of checking things you made adjustments to overall and seeing how you did, seeing how the ownership for your individual contest actually ended up working out. But if you want a big data dump of the actual all ownerships, you can do that there. And that's pretty easy by downloading that CSV off of DraftKings. So, and again, yes, a very strong note overall that ownership does vary pretty wildly for different contest sizes, for different entry limits, and for different stakes. So definitely always remember that there is some natural variance there. There was kind of a question here overall from Andrew about, is there options on Saber for this? There isn't at the moment. This is something that we've had requested before, especially working with the actual scores, right? We do pull in some actual score data from players. So we've had questions about, can we pull in actual ownership data for players? I believe the way we calculate actual score is actually by pulling in actual stats and making that calculation ourselves, but I am not positive on that. which means that calculate or pulling in actual ownership is a little bit trickier because we have to engage directly with DraftKings on that, or FanDuel potentially, and that is a little bit of a bigger lift, a bigger project overall. But we have heard good questions and good wish list requests for having something like that pulled into the app, and that is on our radar. So, but good question overall there. Let me make sure real quick here. We're all good. Okay, cool. So I'm going to just keep us going, guys. We still have some more questions that came in here over the weekend. A really good question from James here. And he said, as of right now, I'm seeing games that look like they are all going to be pretty close. No huge blowouts. Maybe Houston, as of right now, 2-1 over KC, if you consider that a blowout. But here's my question. What's your initial approach to this type of slate? What are some things to look at to see where to get an edge on our opponents? Yeah, I think it's interesting that you brought up blowouts here, because I think it's, at least in DFS in general, kind of a commonly overused or overinflated metric of picking players. I don't know how big it is in baseball. Especially, we're not really going to have, there's some pinch hitting risk, and there's teams that at this point of the season just downright don't even care about winning. I think on the betting side, I think there's been some interesting discussions about our betting model at times maybe kind of overestimating underdogs, assuming that they really kind of care and are trying to win games at this point, which some of them clearly are not. I don't think overall blowouts are something that I'm really going to look at heavily in baseball, because for the most part, the best players are going to stay in the game and they're still going to at least get their at-bats. I don't think it dramatically impacts the game, but it does definitely in things like basketball and football. And I think what happens often, or at least what I see around the industry, is that especially in basketball, games that are kind of assumed to be blowouts, or at least project on the average as blowouts, often just end up getting crossed off the list, or just excluded, or capped exposure to players by DFS players. And I think what that misses here, even from people that really well understand the concepts of ceilings and upside and these things that we're looking for in our lineups, they don't really look exactly at the outlier conditions of those games, right? If the I don't even know, maybe the Bucks are playing the Thunder or something like that, and there's a 10.5 point spread, right? There are outlier games on both sides, right? But the outlier games that concern us when we're chasing upside would be a game situation where that game kind of probably stays close. And there are plenty of game simulations where that does happen, and you get ceiling performances from players on both sides. And I guess what I actually end up doing in my process here is just allowing smart diversity to bucket my game sims in such a way that the prevalence of those games shows up in my lineups in the natural percentage of what the likelihood of that game actually happening is, right? And I think there's edge on the field naturally just with that, because what a lot of other people are doing is looking at that average outcome, 10.5 point spread, and saying, I'm crossing this game off. It's a blowout. Giannis is only going to play 25 minutes, right? But in reality, again, there are, even if it's, I don't know, 10% or 15% of our game sims, it's a lot of different individual outcomes of that game where it does stay close and the starters all play a bunch of minutes. So in general, I think for baseball, it's not something I'm as concerned with overall, even for something like pitchers, right? Like if a pitcher is just lighting up the other team, if I don't know, let's say like Greinke is shutting out the Royal, right? It's a two run spread or difference here before the game starts, and say through 7 innings, right, it's 10-0 or something like that, but Greinke's pitching a gem of a game, and individual teams are going to pull their pitcher at different points, but maybe it's like a no-hitter or something like that. Even if they're up by 10 runs, it's possible he gets yanked. I think people will be pretty upset about that when that kind of thing happens, but a lot of times for chasing things like complete game and complete game shutouts and no-hitters and these stats that really matter to pitchers, those guys just end up staying in the game anyway, and they have even more incentive to keep performing, right? So the impact of like what we're generally concerned about with blowouts in DFS is starters getting pulled, which is something that I think is more likely to happen in football, in basketball, especially. In baseball, I just don't really think even when the blowout occurs, I don't think it has much of a negative impact on the ceiling potential of the players playing in the game. But good question. And I think definitely something I look forward to coming back to when we start basketball season in particular. I think it's worth considering in football too a little bit. Maybe a little less so. Depends on the team. Patriots, I know, are definitely always likely to just pile it on their opponents. I think there's a lot of teams in football like that. Football, very easy to come back in games too, where I think in basketball games can be teams will throw in the towel a little bit more, pull those starters. But good question overall. So for now, I don't think it's a huge thing for thinking about baseball. But all right, cool. So let's keep it going here. This was a really good contest selection question from TMB, and Will chimed in here in office hours, and I think he pretty much just hit the nail on the head, but we'll cover this real quick. So the question said, you say in your MLB process videos, bankroll management and contest selection video, that playing in contests with 1K plus valid entrants, real quick, that is actually effective entrance, and I'll define that in a moment. But he said gives a better chance to win due to having more casuals. But most other sites and experts say it's much easier to win contests with less than 1K entrants and much easier with less than 500. Can you please explain why playing against more entrants is easier to win in your eyes than less entrants? So yeah, I think part of the confusion here is it's not just the raw number of entrants in the contest. It is the number of effective entrants in the contest. And effective entrants is the number of total lineups divided by the maximum entry limit per person, basically. So a 50K to a 50K entry contest that has a 50K entry contest that has a 150 entry limit could potentially just be maxed out by 333 people, right? Whereas a 10,000 person 3 max would take 3,333 people to max out. And the idea here is that the sharpest players on pretty much any DFS site are often maxing out their contests and also playing often very high volume. So the 333 people, the hypothetical 333 people that would max out that 150 max, are probably also all going to be in this contest. But in this contest, they only represent 1/10 of the entries, right? Let's just make for sake of example, let's make a really general assumption that there's only 2 contests in the lobby, and they're these 2, right? And there's only 200 skilled players playing that night, just for example, or 200 skilled players that are more skilled than you. Would be a good way of looking at it. So in the first contest, the 150 max, the 200 skilled players represent about 60% of the player pool, right? That's going to be a very hard contest to win, even though it has 50,000. Even though it has, well, I guess this isn't the best example now for this particular question. Let's pause here for a second because I want to match this question perfectly. So contest A is a 10,000 person 150 max, right? So that could be maxed out by just 67-ish people, right? Contest B is a 15,000 person 3 max. 15,000 person 3 max. That would take 5,000 people to max, right? And let's say there are 100 skilled players that are more skilled than you playing that night, right? So in contest A, 10,000, divided by 150. And I said there were 50 skilled players? 50 skilled players, right? The 50 skilled players represent almost 75% or over 75% of the people in that contest, right? There's less overall entries you're competing against, but they are entered by much more skilled players overall. In contest B, right, there's 5,000 potentially people total playing, each playing 3 lineups, but the skilled players only represent 1% of the entries in that contest. So even though there are much more entries, or there are more entries in contest B, it is a softer contest overall to play because the skill of the players playing that contest is lower, right? The impact of the best players overall in the lobby that typically play almost every contest, max out almost every contest, is diminished in a contest where the entry limit is lower and the overall effective entrance is higher. And I think that's kind of basically what Will summarized, probably way more articulately and concisely than I did. But he basically just said the smaller a contest is the higher probability. The smaller the contest, the higher the probability you have of winning. But the softer a contest, the higher expected value you can get. And I think this is very true in general, right? In contest 1 here, we essentially have, if we're perfectly average, a 1 out of 10,000 chance of winning for every lineup. And in contest 2, we only have a 1 out of 15,000 chance of winning in every lineup if we're like perfectly average. But in reality, that doesn't actually match what's happening here, because in contest B, we probably have a much greater chance of winning that contest because the field is so much softer. So, Brandon said, and I see, Jim, you have a question too, so I'll get to that. He said, so if we're talking about single entry, playing against 1K is easier to win than 100 person. That's where it gets hard. It's difficult to answer that question as just a statement of fact, right? Obviously, your probability of winning as a perfectly average player, or even a player that has a slight edge on the field, is probably higher in the 100 man, right? Just because there's that much less lineups. But it is probably true that the people that are in your 100 person contest are more skilled players than the 1,000 person contest, because those players are probably playing both contests, and the impact of the skilled players is greater in the smaller contest, right? In a single entry, I think all single entries are good contests to play, right? So I think both of these contests are probably kind of equal. I think the 100-man, maybe you still have a little bit of a greater chance to win depending on who overall enters it. The point of this, the line of thinking, right, the reason is to allow people an opportunity to recognize that contests like the mini max and these big 150 maxes are sharper than people think, right? It's easy to look at a mini max and say it's under $3. There's 50,000 people in it, right? I've got as good a shot at anybody to take this thing down. But when you remember and you look at something like this and say it only takes 333 150 maxers to max it out. Now, this isn't actually how the contest is going to be filled. It's going to be less than this. But the impact of each 150 maxer that's playing the mini max is significant, right? It eats up a lot of entries, and it eats up a lot of entries by probably a sharp player. So the point is to kind of look out for things like that, and to look for contests that have over 1,000 effective entrants, because you're going to, it's going to allow you to play contests where you're competing against bigger numbers of softer opponents. So I don't want to give the impression that, like, looking at a question like this, it's easier to beat 999 people than it is easier to beat 99 people, because obviously that's silly, right? It's easier to beat 99. But you've got to remember that not all the players in every contest are equal. And the most skilled players in the lobby in any given night are often always maxing out their contests that they're playing, or they're taking up a great deal of the percentage of lineups in that contest, and they're playing almost every single contest within a certain level of stakes. So if these were your only two options that night, and you're a really good DFS player, and there's only 50 people in the lobby that are better than you on average or over a long period of time, right? 50 divided by 1,000, is 5%. I should be able to do some of this in my head, but I can't think and calculate some of this stuff at the same time. It's only 5% of the people in that contest, right? That are better than you long term. But they represent half of the contest in the 100-man if they were all playing that contest. So it might be much harder to win, or it might be harder to win that 100-man against 50 people that are better than you than it is to win the 1,000 man, where most of the field is really soft. So that's kind of the spirit behind this. That's kind of why we talk about this stuff in your contest selection mix. And again, it's always a little bit of a tug of war here with contest selection about what you want to target, right? Because there aren't always a lot of contests that are out there that are really soft and fit everything that we say. Yeah. Aaron said that nickel contest is tough on FanDuel. I've won it only twice in 5 years. Yeah. So I know that contest, right? I think it's typically like on the big slates, it's like 150,000 people and everybody gets 150 entries. So that's 1,000 effective entrants. And it's a nickel contest. So there's not sharks in that contest. And it's one that theoretically grades out well, but it is hard to win because at the end of the day, you're still trying to be 1 in 150,000. So yeah, there's like a little bit of a balance there of where this can be kind of taken. So the point, and this video, if you haven't seen it, is referencing this guide we have on, or course on our site under resources, strategy, baseball, and course. And it's referencing this first one, bankroll management and contest selection, where Andy actually goes through and walks through the DraftKings lobby and talks about what the best contests are to play based on the stakes and the entry limit and the payout structures and effective entrants. And in reality, all these things kind of come together and you need to consider all these things at once. So there might be a contest that has a really good payout structure and is under $3, but doesn't have 1,000 effective entrants. And that's like you might weigh that differently than a contest that has, I don't know, 5,000 effective entrants, but it's above $3. So sharks and players with $1 million in lifetime winnings can play it. The payout structure maybe is steeper, right? So maybe you don't want to play that. Right? A lot of this contest selection stuff, you have to kind of weigh things together. But anyway, I feel like I've talked about this enough. Okay, maybe not. Let's see. Jim said, I don't get it. If there's a 10K man contest with 150 entries, that's 66 effective entrants. That's not even close to 1,000 effective entrants. What contest do you recommend? That contest will be the one you've just described here would be a very difficult contest to win because the impact, it will be a sharp contest, I guess. The impact of the 150 man maxers in that contest is going to be massive, right? If 33 people come in to max that contest, that's going to take up half of the overall entries. And those players are probably going to be very skilled contests overall, the very skilled players overall. So it's going to be a difficult contest to win. It's going to be very sharp. So overall, what contest do you recommend? Our general rule of thumb is to play contests that are under $3, right? So that people with $1 million in lifetime winnings cannot enter it. And to play contests that are over 1,000 effective entrants, over 1,000, right? So that's important. So that's the number of total entries in a contest divided by the entry limit for any given player, right? Over 1,000 effective entrants. And then from there to start at the lowest dollar amount that you can and play as many entries as you can into as possible to lower your variance and to go up in stakes from the bottom. All of this is summarized in more detail in this video. I would recommend checking this out if you haven't already. I hope I didn't manage to end up confusing anybody more from answering this question because I think it was answered way more articulately and concisely by Will in Slack. But I would recommend watching this video that breaks it down in a little bit more detail. So from a practical standpoint, what you will find if you go through this process is you'll find that under $3, it makes sense to play the single entries first, then the 3 maxes, then the 20 maxes. So, okay, here, let's see. We'll stay on this. So let me pull up DraftKings, for example. Okay, so let's look at the slate tonight. Okay, so let's limit this to $3, which I can play because I'm not. Okay, so let's say you were comparing, and we're going to play the classic slate only with classic. Classic. They changed that. Okay. Okay, so okay, Jim said, okay, wait, if it's 1,000-man single entry, that is 1,000 effective. Yes, that is true. That is 1,000 effective entrants. So basically the idea would be if you were comparing between, are there two contests that are similarly close? I don't know. Let's just, I mean, even just looking at the two mini maxes, right? So maybe it's a lot of the same two players that are going to be playing these, right? Even though this contest has way more entries in it, it has double 47.5K versus 23.5K, right? This contest, from a pure probability standpoint, is probably easier to win. But the impact of 150 maxers is greater in the mini max, in this 50-cent mini max, right? Because there's going to be a lot of people maxing this out, like me. I'm not playing this one, but I am playing this one, that are going to be maxing this out. And their impact is going to be greater because it only takes 150 people maxing this contest out to fill it, right? Whereas in this contest, it's going to take 316 people to max it out, right? So the leftover lineups of all the people that aren't maxing it out, that are just throwing 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 or 20 people, right? A lot of times, generally the softest people in the contests take up a greater percent of the overall lineups in the $1 mini max than they do in the 50-cent mini max, which means you may have higher expected value. You're up against a softer field on the lineups you're entering in something like the $1 mini max than the 50-cent mini max, even though there's less overall entries in this contest. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and leave this there. Hopefully I didn't manage to confuse anybody. If somebody feels a little bit lost overall about this, I would review this video first. This part 2 bankroll management and contest selection strategy video. Give this a watch. Get Andy's take on this overall, and then come back to me maybe tomorrow if you still have any follow-up questions on it. And I'm happy to talk contest selection more. But we still have plenty to get to, so I'm gonna just move us along here. But apologies if I managed to confuse anybody a little bit here talking about this. But we are through all the questions I got in Slack, so I'm gonna go ahead and hit some of these questions that we got in YouTube. So this is from Nacho Man, Jordan the Goat. What's going on, my guy? What's up, dude? How does one use SaberSim to build lineups in different types of contests in MMA? As you know, there are randomness sliders and not smart diversity, which feels less scientific. Yeah. So let's go ahead and jump over to MMA real quick here. So first of all, I've mentioned that we are working on sims here on the MMA model, kind of behind the scenes. Right now, these are just raw projections. So I've mentioned this a few times here, but they're not generated by sims of the fights themselves. You can't click on players and get real ranges of outcomes. At the moment, we just have smart randomness instead of smart diversity, which is essentially just going to assume a normal distribution for these fighters. And the higher this goes, the higher that randomness is going to be. It is a little less of a robust approach at the moment. Our sims that we have been building and working on behind the scene are very close for MMA. So we are hoping to release those soon, which will actually have ranges of outcomes for fighters, which will be really cool. And we should be able to replace smart randomness with smart diversity. So that is coming very soon. I will say, we also right now don't have default sliders for MMA because it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to run those back tests on something like smart randomness when we know that the sims are coming and smart diversity is a more nuanced solution anyway. So we don't have default sliders for MMA for now. In terms of determining what kind of sliders to use for certain contests, what I actually end up doing most of the time is I borrow the golf sliders and use those for my MMA sliders. That's literally just like what my approach is. And my reasoning there is that it is a non-correlated sport, right? Similarly, it's also a very high variance sport. And actually, the ranges of outcomes of golfers actually end up looking about like what we might expect a range of outcomes to look like for a fighter, because they both have a binary event, which is in one case, in golf, it's the cut, right? There's a golfer can get cut or not. And based on either of those outcomes, they have a kind of curve or a range of outcomes associated with either event. In MMA, I expect, we'll see what this actually ends up looking like once we put this out, but I actually expect MMA fighters' ranges of outcomes to look similar, because there's going to be a binary event if they either win or lose the fight, where a lot of the points are baked into that. And then from there, they're both going to have the range of outcomes for both of those events, right? There's a fighter that wins by decision, which is their low range of their winning outcomes, versus a first round knockout or submission or something like that, which is going to be on the higher range of their outcomes. So what I've been doing for now, since I find that these two sports at least are similar, the way they kind of make sense in my head, is to borrow sliders, default sliders from golf based on the contest I'm playing, and use them for my MMA builds. But coming very soon is the MMA sim, and that will allow us to see ranges of outcomes of fighters, that will allow us to use smart diversity and engage with the sims at a more basic level, and pretty excited about that. But right now, I kind of just borrow it will also, I guess, allow us to run our slider back tests and hopefully come up with default sliders for MMA. So that is all coming. I know this question came in right at the start of the stream, so I apologize that I'm getting to this here so far to the end. But if you're still sitting around here, Nacho Man, Sandy Cabbage, let me know if you have any other follow-up questions. So, okay. So another question had come in from James here at the start of the show. He said, if I want to enter 20 to 30 entries in the 150 max contest on FanDuel at 25 cents a piece, how do I make sure I'm getting all uniques because I have an entry in that contest already? Need help with that. Okay. So what I would do is, if you already have, I assume what you have is like, well, okay, here's what I would do. I would go through and make sure you have however many entries in that contest that you want. So say it's 30. Make sure that you enter it 30 times. And then go into the builder and run your build. And build your lineups. And when you build this, we're not going to build you any duplicates. So if you have 30 and you build your 30, none of these are going to be dupes. So let me move down to the bottom here. Build your 30. None of these are going to be duplicated. And then use the entry editor once you have your 30 lineups here, and fill your contest. So upload your entries file, fill your 30 lineups with the lineups that are built here, of which will have no duplicates, and then download that CSV and enter it. And that should work out for you. So I'm not even going to let this build finish. We don't really need it, but all 30 of these that pop up will be unique lineups. So yeah, okay. So I don't have, so then James said, and then upload them into the entries file. So I don't actually have FanDuel entries for tonight, but what you'll do is you would go in and click download template file from FanDuel. You'll see I have like just not very much money here, but there'll be a button that says CSV edit, and you can download that CSV, then upload that here. I guess I could do it with DraftKings real quick and show you. It's going to be a little bit different, but so you can download the CSV. Okay, so you have all these contests, and then you click fill contest with lineups. In this particular case, you'll just have the one contest. So maybe it's just the mini-max. You can hit fill contest with lineups. You pick the exact build that you want. Maybe it's this one, and click fill. It's going to fill the lineups, download all entries. On FanDuel, you can click download and open FanDuel. And what it's going to do is it's going to take you back to this tab, and you can upload it to the right spot on the entry editor here. Or not on the entry editor, on FanDuel. There'll be a spot that says like browse, you navigate, click the file, and upload it. So, all right, cool. Let's keep us rolling here. Okay. Aaron said, how do you feel about setting a max exposure to the bottom of the order batters? Yeah, I don't really worry too much about where hitters are in the batting order. I think it is overrated, to be completely honest. You'll see even at, like, you take a team, I know Colorado was popping in our stacks earlier, right? Even at an average projection, there's some difference between how these players are projected, right? There's actually like almost a 50% difference between the top order guy and the bottom order guy. But when we look at the outcomes that actually matter, which is the ceiling projections, these guys have like fairly real, like similar ceilings. There's still a little bit of a difference here. A lot of times that comes through from the one extra at bat. But I think the batting order thing is a little bit overrated. The higher a ceiling goes, the impact of a player at the top of the order, their likelihood of outperforming a player at the bottom of the order goes down, like from a percentage standpoint. Garrett Hampson's ceiling is not as dramatically different from Connor Joe's ceiling as his average projection would have you indicate. I think players over-own top of the batting order guys all the time. I think even on the chalkiest stacks, like the Houston stack tonight, I think the bottom of the order guys are going to be disproportionately low owned based on their ceiling potential, right? Like we can look at Houston too. I would not be surprised if this is the exact batting order that we get, if Altuve and Brantley and Correa and Alvarez are very highly owned, and you get guys like Jake Myers and Chas McCormick and Maldonado at much lower ownership, and their ceilings are not as the ceiling differential is much smaller than what the ownership differential will be. So I really just don't even worry too much about batting order. I let stacks of the lower in the order guys show up in my builds as the builder thinks is appropriate. And it's just not something that I pay much attention to. And I think it's overstated in general around the industry. The need to limit exposure to lower in the batting order guys. But good question. Okay, cool. Question from Tracy here. If I make 300 lineups and export the lineups to DK, I've noticed that DK switches the order they are in when I want to use one-click max. Is there a way to correct this? Well, I don't know exactly what you mean by one-click max. I know this message came in here now almost an hour ago, so I apologize, Tracy, for getting to this late. I'm a little confused on what you mean by one click max. Yeah, I'm not totally sure. Maybe it's like a contest entry thing. I think if you don't already have it, like by far the easiest, the editing your lineups by CSVs and things like that can just be a bit tedious, and it requires you to be really pretty dialed in to your CSVs and like line by line, especially if you're going to be making a bunch of different lineups for different contests. Making sure your right lineups get into the right contest can just be cause a little bit of brain damage when you're looking at the CSVs. I would recommend, if you haven't already, trying out the entry editor because it's going to allow you to avoid all of this, right? You can do things like say, I'm only filling, or you can fill all of your lineups right at once, either using a rank or unique fill method. You can highlight specific contests that you are trying to fill and just fill those one at a time. It basically gives you like a visual interface to allow you to control all of your lineups and make sure that your lineups end up in the right contests and things like that. I'm a little bit confused on this question because I'm not exactly sure with DK switching the order what that means. The order of your lineups, at least the way DraftKings interprets them in their like over here, shouldn't really matter as long as the lineups are in the right contests. How your lineups overall present themselves really shouldn't matter too much. Oh, I didn't download that, but this shouldn't really matter as long as they're in the right contests. But in terms of getting them into the right contests, I think the entry editor makes that a lot easier. So I'd recommend trying it out if you haven't already. You can add a trial too in account management. Start free trial down here next to entry editor. Sorry, Tracy. I realize this probably isn't a great answer to your question. I don't even know if you are still watching along here with me, but I'm just a little bit confused too. So if you end up watching this back, let me know what you mean by one click max, and also what you're referring to in the lineup order, because I'm thinking if you're looking literally at just what order the lineups are in on DraftKings, it probably doesn't actually matter. So, but happy to come back to this if we need to. Okay. I think we got through pretty much everything. Oh, no, there was one other question here from Ryan. And Ryan, this was about MLB Showdowns. And he said, I've been playing a lot of MLB Showdown lately and was wondering how many manual adjustments you make to exposures. I know you make a lot of changes for the main slate, but maybe you're more inclined to trust the builder for the smaller showdowns. Thanks. Yeah, I actually am. I'm very trusting of the builder for my showdown lineups. I think it is an opportunity where smart diversity in particular gets to shine. So let's go look at like a showdown, maybe for the Yankees Braves game here. Especially because this is literally just a single game that is played once. I find that for most of the contests I'm playing, the default sliders, I'll even sometimes turn these off. I'm not even super concerned about correlation and ownership. Just basically taking advantage of the single game simulations and just playing the 20 best game simulations or the 20 highest projected overall game simulations, I find is just a very successful way of playing Showdown. I have a few other strategies that I use from there that are well described in our YouTube channel strategy session. So on our YouTube channel in strategy sessions down here, there is a how to beat MLB DFS Showdown contest. So Chris was on here with me, who also plays a ton of baseball Showdown. We talked for about an hour about individual Showdown strategy, especially with things like relief pitchers and a few other things that come up that are kind of unique to Showdown. So I recommend watching this if you're interested in like an hour-long deep dive into MLB Showdown. But I do, in general, have a very trusting pattern or process with MLB Showdowns because I think SaberSim in some ways is just built to excel at that because we're simulating games. So using individual game sims with a smart diversity at 10 is just awesome. I find it works really well. The only caveat I really would make to that is that I'm often playing contests. There aren't for regular season baseball showdowns, there aren't really huge contests to play. So I'm playing like typically contests that are in here or in here, where the builder is basically saying that that's the optimal way to play anyway. For stuff like playoffs showdowns and World Series showdowns, you end up with contests that are a little bit more like up here or up here. And what the builder is then indicating to us is that we have to start thinking about ownership a little bit more and even effects of correlation, but really in particular ownership, and that it may not be enough to play highly projected lineups that come out of individual game sims. We actually have to start thinking more about ownership. And when those games start to come up, I am more likely at that point to start drifting a little bit more towards my normal process, which would be running research builds where I'm running like this, but I'm building 150 so that I can get a pool of 1,500 lineups. And I'm looking at like the percent chance to be optimal of certain captains and mostly captains, and comparing that to what I think the ownership of certain captains are going to be. And then from there, doing things with my exposures, right? I'm making more strong fades on a lot of times pitchers who, even if they are the highest percent chance to be optimal as an individual player at the captain spot, they are often much higher owned than they should be. And I will make adjustments to exposures there for pitchers on like big tournaments for MLB showdowns, especially for things like the World Series and for playoff, there was a showdown slate coming out of the All-Star break for the Boston and New York single game that brought us back from the All-Star break that had big contests on something like that. I'm thinking about that, but in a 1,000-person contest for typical regular season baseball, where the sliders are basically saying like do something like this, I find that I end up just kind of trusting what I get out of this because we have single game simulations. It's like built for this. So it's perfect. But don't know if you're still here, Ryan. If you are, give me a shout. Let me know if that was helpful. I think that was my last question. We have had an awesome show today. We have covered everything pretty much. Hour and a half here on the show today. We started talking about cash versus GPP, back to some basics, talking about differences between those two game types, why there are differences, what our goals are in those types. We talked about how much to value your own research versus SaberSim and how to make changes as you need. We talked a little bit. What else? What else did we talk about? We did some NFL stacking rules, which was cool. We talked about ownership. We talked about contest selection for a long time. Went through some stuff with effective entrants and what the best contests to play are overall, and the balance of like the raw probability of winning a contest versus judging how soft the field is going to be and how soft that contest is actually going to play out. We talked a little bit about, what do we just do here? MMA and showdowns here close to the end. So it has been an awesome show. I knew we were going to have plenty to talk about here today because there were a bunch of questions that came in over the weekend. I think I managed to cover pretty much everything here today. If I missed anything, or if you guys watched this show back later, and especially I think a few of you guys ended up heading out, which I don't blame you for. I know this was a long stream here today. But if you come back, watch one of the questions that I answered earlier and have any questions, throw them into the Office Hours channel in Slack, because we will be right back here again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. We do this Monday through Friday. So give me another dozen questions to answer tomorrow. This was a great stream here today. As always, I appreciate you guys all being here, asking questions, being a part of this. And until then, I guess I will see you guys tomorrow. See ya.